Hello, welcome back to another episode of History Hack. You know I got to do a bit of housekeeping. I'm so sorry. Like I've said before, let's blame it all on Alex. Remember, you can leave us a 5-star review on Apple, right? Anything. We just need those ratings so people can see more of our podcast. Don't forget, we also have a new website, www.historyhack.co.uk, where you can find our bios, info, and hopefully soon there will be merch. If you really like us, you can give us a one-off donation on Ko-fi, which is ko-fi.com/historyhack. You know, we still have to fund all of those habits, and my dogs are pretty much starving, or at least that's what they're telling me. You can also subscribe to our Patreon, which is www.patreon.com/historyhack. There you can find absolutely awesome things. You can go to our book prize raffle and also find super duper 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 perks with Chris, of course. You can take him out for a dinner date. He is cheap. He will take a McDonald's. Anyway, moving on to our guest today, we have with us Luke Pepera, who is an anthropologist, historian, writer, broadcaster, and he specializes in Africa. We've been so Europe-centric, so we needed to get someone on to come and do some African history we haven't had for ages. His new book, Motherland, will be out in 8 months' time, and he will come back. Don't worry, he's fabulous. He's here, and he's here all to talk to us about the history of Africa. Hi, Luke.
Hello, thank you for having me on.
Oh, I am so happy. I cornered Luke at Claire Mulley's book launch.
Yes. That was the first time we met, and we were talking, and then you mentioned this podcast, and I was talking a little bit about my African research, and we said we had to make something happen.
I know it's like I've said, we're so Eurocentric. I'm Eurocentric. I really am Eurocentric, and it's nice to kind of get out of your comfort zone a little bit. And this is exactly what you're doing, and you're writing about African history. And I'm interested in why. How did you decide to work on African history? Why not, I don't know, the history of Japan or the history of Australia?
Funny enough, it's funny you mentioned Japan. Actually, that's one of my personal interests is Japan.
Stop it.
I'm a huge fan of 20th century Japanese fiction. Mystery fiction.
No,
and
I
love Japan and Japanese history, so I read quite a lot about that. I mean, I'm generally quite interested in world history and the interactions between different peoples on different continents as well. But I suppose the easy answer with regards to Africa is that I am African myself. I was born and raised in Ghana, and frequently went back there. So I went, I was at school there for the first 8 years of my life, and frequently went back, and it is considered home. I have family there, and was always going back and engaging in the culture, trying to have as much Ghanaian food and Ghanaian interaction as possible. But it was when I was it was one time I was at holiday there. I went to school in the UK, but I was on holiday in Ghana, and as I was. I'd always been interested in history. Actually, my first foray into history and the past was actually Greek and Roman stuff and Greek and Roman mythology. I was actually really interested in that, and that's actually what I did at school here. And
Snap.
I knew, I know, it is a great entryway, I think, for a lot of people, and it's great that so many people branch out. But I suppose if you're going to school in the UK, you will come across it, and the stories are great, and the history, the mystery of the past that it sort of fosters is quite interesting as well. But I knew that although I came to school here, but being in Ghana, I knew that there were also elements of the history there comparable to what I was learning at school in the UK that I know just hadn't been researched. And I wasn't necessarily advocating for it to be taught in the classrooms in the UK, but I was actually just more interested in finding it out for myself, because it was another, it was almost like the more the merrier. The more information I could find out about this kind of history, the better. So I was doing a little bit of my own research, and then I was doing a school project on the history of one of the ethnic groups I belong to, the Kweu, and my dad suggested we go to the museum. The Ghana has a national museum there, and we went. And the museum, it's got a lot better now, but at the time that I went, this must have been 2012. There were a lot of colonial era artifacts, which is fine, but I didn't find it particularly engaging. I was always interested in the deeper past, hence my engagement with the Greek and Roman stuff as well. So I got in touch with a couple of professors at the University of Ghana, and one archaeology professor. They had this museum at the back of the archaeology department to the University of Legon in Ghana, and he showed me these artifacts, these Iron Age artifacts, and they dated to about 500 AD, and apparently they were excavated in Ghana. So that was interesting to me. And then I went to the lecture of another professor who was doing one on it was on chieftaincies. So there was the traditional culture and the traditional culture elements, a bit of the history of that. And I thought to myself, there's just so much richness here, and I wanted to explore more. So I applied to study archaeology and anthropology at university, and there I was, doing a little bit of, on African history and African archaeology and African anthropology. And I did one module on the formation of sub-Saharan African states, and in doing that is when I was really kind of introduced to a lot of the ancient and medieval African history that kind of fostered my general interest in the subject. And I just became keen to not only research more of this, but actually tell some of the stories, so there are people who are interested in it, could engage with it as well. I mean, like I said, I'm fascinated by the history of other places, I mean, including Europe. I actually had a really good talk with one of your previous guests, Tracy Borman, on the Tudors. Like, I love that stuff as well, but I also love, Japan, China, Russia, what we know now as the Middle East, East Africa. I'm engaged. I mean, I think I'm more interested in how Africa fits into all of that, not only being
Mm.
Africa, not only finding a special interest in that, but then also seeing it as somewhere that's, the more I learn about it, the more I understand it as being criminally understudied, criminally misunderstood, and given my background and my what I specialized in, what I studied, I felt that I could really do something in bringing a lot of African history to light. So that's why I decided to focus there, but also situating Africa in a global context is also really important for me.
It's really interesting because when you think of African history, you don't necessarily think of, well, maybe people do think of, like, for example, tribes, people living in the middle of the desert. They don't
Yeah.
see that Africa, number one, is a developed country, and when you do go,
Well,
you
the
do
countries there, yeah, very
you,
developed. Yeah.
or you think of Egypt, for example. That's the
Yeah,
other thing.
Egypt is always. Yeah. I mean, I think it's it's a difficult one. I think so many people's perspective on Africa is so coloured, obviously, by the last 100 years. The era of
Mm.
colonialism, which did do a lot to impact the continent. But I think humanity begins Africa. I mean, the sheer amount of different people, societies, cultures that have existed, and in some cases continue to exist, and in other cases completely unchanged for millennia and even tens of millennia. You don't see that anywhere else except for in Africa. So I think that's one level. I think another one, to be honest, is I think it goes to our understanding of what advancement, development, and sophistication is. And I think in Europe or in the UK, I would say more particularly, actually, and to a greater extent in the US, which obviously has such a big global cultural footprint. The material aspects are so important with regards to development and advancement, sophistication. It's all to do with how much you're making, GDP, how much you can afford, that's all, how much you can buy, basically, seems to. Whereas in Africa, what I found that's quite interesting is a lot of it is to do more with social and cultural development. So, for example, a lot of the practices that, interesting enough, in the 19th century were being studied by 19th European anthropologists, being deemed as backward or primitive, etc., were actually incredibly sophisticated, but they didn't go towards necessarily improving people's lives in the material sense. It didn't mean they had fancier modes of transport or bigger houses or whatever, but it really fostered and improved the relationships between themselves and each other, and also the perpetuation, or the health and the perpetuation of the community, as a whole. And I found that's just, but then that's just a perspective that you don't really get if you haven't, grown up in an African, or in some cases an Indian or a Chinese context, where that is a little bit more stressed generally. Obviously there are differences between them. I don't want to say they're equal, but that is just generally a little bit more stress. When I speak to, a lot of people who've grown up in the Indian context, the value systems are like relatively, community, family, is a lot more important. And the things that are to do with that and engage that, whether it's festivals or holidays or whatever it is, the spiritual aspects, it all kind of goes towards that. But I think because those, where, I think history is as we understand a lot of times, as a discipline, as an intellectual and an academic discipline, tends to focus on and stress certain things that are really important in a Western European context, but aren't as important. And that's not, that this isn't a criticism saying it's right or wrong. It's actually just, I think, an observation of a difference in cultures and what is important, to different people in different cultures as well. So I think, my approach, I take a sort of mixed European and African approach, to history, but I really try and bring out some of the, the aspects that would make sense to and be important in an African context as well. But I think it's that level of slight, misunderstanding, a lack of impetus on certain things that means that, African history hasn't really been, given its proper due.
So I agree. Do you know what it is? Putting it in the perspective of what I study. So Poland and Eastern Europe isn't anything, or Central Europe before somebody shoots me, is not anything like Western Europe at all. The culture is different. The mentality is different. We were occupied for 123 years. Borders changed, wars were fought, blah, 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 blah. So you can't necessarily put it in the same context as, like, for example, Britain or France or America. So you need to be able to understand the mentality of the Poles, because it is really important to understand why they did what they did when they did it. And when you have somebody who comes along and has absolutely no idea and tries to tell the history of Poland, it doesn't make quite sense. It's like, well, why did they behave the way they did? Why did they do this? Why did they do that? Why did they rise up, for example, 3 times in the 19 interwar period or whatever? Why is all of this happening? And same thing for you, for example. You need to be able to at least understand the culture, understand a little bit of the history. And I'm like you, grew up more or less in the UK, so I still have that Western tendency.
Yeah.
And the same as I have my home culture, my family and everything else. So I think you and I kind of make a super historian, really.
Yeah. No, yeah. I mean, I think what you say is 100%. I think when you have the sort of foot in two camps to a certain degree, you can see things from the other side. But I think it gives you such a powerful perspective on certain histories, and in particularly on your own history or on the histories of people, who were in either have a similar background, or a similar context. And that's, I'm kind of learning that more and more as I'm delving deeper into African history. And even the way that it's recorded, the way that it's told, what is important, what people remember, why they remember it, it's actually all different. And at least, even if you don't subscribe to it in the way you're telling history, I think an understanding of it can be helpful. But I think it's just one that is, it's almost antithetical to the way in which history is recorded, remembered, and what it means in or at least what it's kind of professed to mean in sort of the in the more Western European context in Africa. That's why a lot of that's why someone like the Professor Hugh Trevor Roper could say that Africa doesn't have history. Now, he wasn't saying that nothing happened, but he's saying that in the way that we study history, I mean, it's probably a really misunderstood quotation, to be fair, but the way that I take it is that the way he's like, the way we study history, i.e. a reliance on written documents, is not something we can apply to Africa. And actually, in that sense, he is sort of right, to be honest. But I mean, I'm probably like most other people take that horribly out of context. But the little bit that I've looked into it, the more that I'm like, actually, maybe there could be something else going on here. You know what I mean? Rather than saying that nothing happened in Africa.
So I'm going to ban pretty much the word 20th century in the next question. Sorry, if you were going to say 20th century. You're not allowed. Not allowed. So you've got to have a favorite period of African history. Obviously, for me, it's 20th century history in Poland. No comment. So for you, it's got to be something else. Can I take a wild guess what it is?
Yeah, go ahead.
You've already mentioned something along the lines of the Iron Age. It's going to be that period, isn't it? Am I right?
Yeah, well, I mean, it is. I mean, probably yeah, it is. But the sort of later, because I really like the I mean, to use the sort of again more like Western model, which is fine. It's just one way of describing and recording history is the sort of late Middle Ages. I really like the 14th, 15th century, which I guess fits into that. I'm just like 500, AD onwards, and people are using that, that technology up
Mm.
until whenever. But yeah, I mean, it is beginning. I sort of like, but the reason I kind of like the 15th, sort of 14th, 15th century is actually it shows that basically a lot of African um, kingdoms and societies were global superpowers in a way that they will probably, or at least I think that they will return to in maybe in decades, probably as short as decades time. And I think it's something that's the opposite, I think, to the narrative of African history and African peoples that is often propagated, which is one of poverty, victimization, oppression, and so which I always find so problematic because it's applied almost to every African people in every place where there were Africans in every time period, as opposed to being contained in a specific time in a specific place, applying to a specific group of people for specific reasons. And this could just be, I think this is mainly due to a lack of knowledge rather than any kind of, conscious attempt to, propagate a narrative that keeps people down. But I think what that period shows in the 15th century is that, and actually, a lot of the 14th century and the 15th century and the 14th century actually being an era before Europeans or Africans engaged with Europe directly at all. There were indirect relations, but there were no Europeans who managed to reach Africa's shores by the 14th century. It was really in the early to mid 15th century that the Portuguese are the first to come. But what it demonstrates is that in this period, without any kind of engagement with there were African societies that were some of the most powerful in the world. From
Right, you need to tell us about this because I'm
yeah.
I'm sitting here thinking, going right. The only one I know about was Mali, right?
So there's Mali, but there was Songhai afterwards, actually, which, for example, the I guess the first emperor, the Askir Muhammad, who's in the early 16th century, which I think he's a bit later. Actually, he's the early 16th century, but he he's there with he's visited by a Moroccan traveler and diplomat who's known as Leo Africanus or Al-Alvazan. But he, for example, gets diplomatic missions from loads of places in North Africa, for example, including Morocco, who and they're important trade partners of each other. But the Songhai Empire, where Timbuktu, the University of Timbuktu, which begins in Mali a century or two roughly beforehand, but it flourishes also in the 16th century. Is a really important international university, taking the top students from all over the world. But the wealth, the reach, the sophistication, the scholarship of this empire is ranges across the continent and beyond. So Songhai, which follows Mali, is an important one. But yes, Mali itself, also Great Zimbabwe and what's now Zimbabwe, is sort of Central South Africa, and also the Swahili, the sort of Swahili community. That wasn't it probably accurately couldn't be described as an empire. It was essentially a collection of city states who had, it was like a confederacy of city states, sort of. They had the relationships between each other, but they were distinct. And they didn't have one overarching ruler. Each city state had its own ruler, but there were city states in what's now Kenya, Tanzania, Somalia, etc., and they were engaged with trade with the Arab world, what's now Iran, China, and India since 1 AD. Since some of these trade partners came later. So the first ones are the Yemenis, or Yemenites, and then also the Persians, beginning in the first century AD, and then it's India and then China as well, up until into the 15th century. and there is direct trade actually between them. So actually, those communities on the Swahili coast grow, very wealthy and also very worldly as well. The rulers of the city states there are feasting on Ming Dynasty porcelain, and they have jars from Iran, and they have butter from India, and all these kinds of things, and they're sending ivory to India where it's being used in chess pieces. And there's even a king of one of the city states in Kenya, I believe it is, Malindi, who in the early 15th century travels to China to meet the Ming Dynasty Emperor the Yongle Emperor, and he actually
Wow.
dies in the voyage, but he's buried in Fujian province in China. So he's actually he's buried in China, and then also the Yongle Emperor decrees that there would be a sacrifice be given to him every year. When while he's on the throne, it's probably stopped after he died because the Ming Dynasty, the Mandarins, after the death of this emperor, basically they thought the China had been making voyages to Africa, they thought they were expensive, so they basically wanted to destroy a record of it. They didn't want anybody doing a similar thing anyway. So, but
God,
it
that's
just
mind
shows,
blowing.
yeah, but it shows the extent of the relation. And those are just a few. That's like the few that I've kind of uncovered, and I'm confident that there are more. But I think also not only the international links, which I think are important, but also the internal links as well. So you also have the kingdoms of of Ife and Benin and what's now Nigeria. You have the Akan kingdoms, in Ghana as well. So there's just a lot happening, on the continent at this time, both, intercontinentally, but also, within the continent, but on also, so intracontinentally, but also across, different continents and different cultures and different peoples. And there's no kind of, I think when you look at this period, the victimization narrative of the Africa falls apart. That there is sort of endemic poverty, and there always has been endemic poverty and oppression, and without aid from Western Europe, African societies wouldn't they be able to do anything? There's a kind of undercuts
Yeah.
that kind of mentality, which I think is really problematic. And to be fair, I wouldn't say it's not even completely the fault of the Western Europe. They're trying to ensure self-power, and then you also have a lot of the African leaders who see it as kind of easy investment. So they also buy into the narrative as well, knowing in some cases knowing full well of the agency that their ancestors had in sort of attracting trade, attracting wealth, etc. To their country. So it wasn't all just foreign, wasn't all just taken from other places. A lot of it was also generated internally.
I've got a question to jump in here.
Yeah.
Still on topic. I wonder how far African trade moved. I mean, obviously it went into China, but would there have been trade amongst the Chinese and other nations of African goods in China?
I don't think so, because I think China was sort of the end of the route. So
Hmm.
what happened is that they would trade. So it at a point it did go directly, but I think a lot of the goods were being consumed in China. So they weren't being taken to be traded on. But for example, they were being taken by the Yemenis and the Persians to be traded on for goods from China. So that was initially how the exchange, up until maybe the 12th century, that was initially. So it was like between the ninth or the main where the trade kind of increases rapidly, and where you probably the latest before you have direct trade between China and Africa is around. I mean, the first voyage is in the 15th century, but between the 9th and the 12th century, that's the first voyage from China to Africa, that is. But between the 9th and the 12th centuries, you have Africans trading with the Yemenis and the and the Iranians, but they're like the middlemen. So they have relationships with people in Central Asia and India, and the goods from China being basically passed along there and ending up in Africa. And the goods from Africa are being passed along the other way and ending up in China. So I think they were consumed in China, actually, to be honest. The things that were in demand, and then in some cases still in demand to a large extent today, animal skins, ivory, live animals. It was more those kinds of things that were being and gold to a certain extent. So it was the minerals, but it was the things that you could actually only get, or you couldn't make them really, and they only existed in Africa.
Mm.
For lack of a better word, this one is very problematic amongst anthropologists, but exotica. is sort of what was sought in, and it was being consumed mainly by the elites in China. They were using ivory for like their palanquins, the umbrella, and they said that we actually have a source. I can't remember who wrote it, but it basically talks about how in China using you have to use like using an iron palanquin is like disgraceful. You have to use one of ivory if you want to show that you are worldly and of the right. You're of the right kind of ilk. So that's where it's being used. So actually, I don't think so,
But it's
from what
not
I
changed
understand.
much, though, has it? People are still
No, not
desiring
really.
these things from Africa, like, for
Yeah.
example, game hunting.
Oh,
I want to go and
exactly.
shoot an elephant.
Yeah, well, exactly. The I mean, it's interesting. I think it still has that kind of rare exotic feel to it. In Africa, I know that they're taking measures to kind of halt it, but in the 15, that was one of the main things. The Irish trade was one of the main things. But actually, that's one of the things I find about African history is that sometimes when you look deeper into it, you sort of see that some of the exchanges or the historical context that you perceive have they have like quite striking modern equivalents. But yes, you're right. You're right. It is still one of the things that is, but I think it's because again, it's one of the things that is, where Africa is really one of the only sources,
Mm.
big sources where you could get, these kinds of things. So that's what attracts people to it. To be honest, I think.
Do you know what? Let's move on a little bit because I want to talk about obviously your favorite person in Africa. This is a really big question, and I know
Mm,
it's a really big ask, but you've got to have somebody that you think of, you like, right, I love that person, or you have a
yeah,
man crush on that person. Because I
I
have
have a
loads of
man
crushes on
crush.
historical figures.
Yeah, to be fair, they're quite a lot. One figure that I thought was actually kind of cooler than he's a little, yeah, I guess in some ways he is a bit controversial, to be honest. But is the 18th century king of Dahomey, Agaja, who was he comes to the throne in the early 80s. So it's like 17, I think it's 1708. He comes to the throne. He's born in the 1670s. I think 1673, if I remember correctly. But he comes to the throne in 1708, and essentially, he is he's like an exceptional king. I think he's arguably the most. So Dahomey, the kingdom of Dahomey, was what's now the country of Benin, basically in West Africa, and that part of Africa in the 17th, mainly the 18th centuries, was known as the Slave Coast because that's where they were transporting and trafficking a lot of enslaved Africans. But I think what people misunderstand is that they think that there was one, I don't know, one kingdom or a group of kingdoms who were wholly interested in profiting from that trade, when in actual fact there were several, tens of kingdoms, if not hundreds of kingdoms all across there. A lot of whom, some of whom did profit and want to profit from the trade, but actually a lot of whom, depending on the leadership, didn't actually wanted to, either control it or halt it or whatever. And from what I understand, looking at a little bit of Agaja stories, he was one of the latter. But Dahomey, under him, becomes quite a powerful kingdom, and it conquers a lot of the kingdoms on the coast, including the two other big ones, which are called Ouida and Alada, and they are big slave export. They're interested in profiting from the trade, or their leadership is. But Agaja basically conquers them, and when he comes into power, when he goes into control, he wants to halt the trade. So he's putting in all these measures to try and do so. And I talk, he features actually in one main chapter, in my book. But what is interesting is how he does it and why he does it. But I think what I admire about him is that he's just so competent, like he's just so capable. He's
Mm.
such a again, even though he's, like I said, he's quite controversial. When he conquers the kingdoms, especially the kingdom of Ouida, because he hates their king Hufon, but he slaughters so many of the Ouidas, and he captures others, a few thousand, and he executes them, and apparently their heads are piled up on altars, and so he's kind of brutal, but he is really competent and really capable. He institutes his own spy network. He's always trying to look for a diplomatic option first, and if that doesn't work, then he takes measures in certain ways. He inspires his soldiers. He reforms his army, so it's incredibly capable. He doesn't bow down to pressure from the kingdoms, but then also from the Europeans. He puts the interests and large part of his people in his kingdom first. He's respectful of his ancestors and his kingdom's tradition. So he has a lot that's really admirable about him. But it's really his capability. I mean, he almost single-handedly conquers the coast in large part to halt or to stay the traded enslaved Africans, which he sees as which he sees as detrimental to the society and culture of the coastal kingdoms, or the societies and cultures of the coastal kingdoms, I should say. So he's quite an interesting figure.
I think the next thing I'm going to say might be a little bit controversial,
Go
but I
ahead.
think you might agree with me, actually. So you've talked about so much African history, and I'm also like interested in Greek and Roman, and I think that
Yeah.
ancient side and the old and how they managed to do things, and like growing grain and hunting and all that kind of stuff is really interesting to me. But the problem with African history is that it is so overshadowed by slavery and colonialism,
Yeah. Yeah.
and you do not get a chance to learn. So if you talk to someone, it's like that's where African history starts, is colonialism, slavery, and
Yeah.
that's it. And there's
Yeah.
nothing
That's when
behind it.
African people start for a lot of people, to be honest.
Well, exactly. Where did they come from? Oh, because they
Yeah.
decided to
Well, exactly.
colonize them all, and
Yeah,
so
exactly.
my question to you with this is that where do you fall on this spectrum? Because obviously your book, well, we're going to come back because when your book gets
Yeah.
published, talk a bit
Yeah.
more. But in general, where do you fall on this sort of?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I seriously, to be fair, I think both on a personal and professional level, I take serious issue with the emphasis on the transatlantic slave trade and colonialism as pertaining to the history of African people, and more particularly the history of Africans in Africa, because you realize, I think, as when you even just look at it a little bit, you realize the depth of history that is in Africa. And to be honest, I'm not one of these people who thinks that they aren't worth studying. The history of slavery and colonialism. I think they are, and I think they are important, and I think they provide an important perspective to the history of not only Africa but a lot of other places as well. But I think they are. I think it. I think it does a disservice to what African history is all about. And I think it also colors, I think, people's views of Africans in the contemporary sense as well, because nowadays people can really only think, when you talk about Africans, or even worse in my estimation, to be honest, quote unquote black people, which is something that I also talk about in the book. You can only see them as the victimized, as the oppressed, as slaves, as the descendants of enslaved people, even if they're not. This is the thing that I talk about. Even if they were born and raised in Africa from free parents going back to whenever, it still colors that view and that perception, and it leads to a lot of sort of ignorant, not in the sort of, in the best sense of the word, not ignorant in terms of people just not caring or not wanting to know, but sort of well-meaning but
Mm,
ignorant and patronizing behavior. And my hope is that by just putting that history in context, it can give a much fuller picture of of the African past. But I think also what is important about that history is not just another thing that I would, like to sort of point out is that even though we are talking about those periods, talking about those periods in of themselves isn't problematic. It is to an extent, but another side of it is that the way we talk about those periods is problematic, because again, there's a sort of one there almost seems to be a kind of black white conflict that seems to arise out of that history, which I find incredibly problematic as well, because in the early stages of contact and trade between Europe and Africa, it was bilateral, and in some cases to the African, was in the African favor, to be honest, because the Europeans who came, they didn't have the net, they relied on African traders and African monarchs to make inroads into into the continent. They didn't have the immunities to certain diseases. They didn't have the forces to be able to take on African kingdoms. They didn't have a knowledge of the landscape and the geography. So they needed so this idea that they came in and immediately controlled everything, I also think is problematic as well. And I think it denies African agency as well. You know, the what, and I think even with my, even though I, for example, in my writing and in my expertise and in my book also in particular cover these periods of African history, I'm always trying to write about things from the African perspective, which is why I talk about, you know, people like Agaja, which is why I talk about the African kingdoms, even though it is in this period where apparently, you know, the Europeans were, you know, were you know, like to say they were sort of at, you know, at the top of everything, and actually look close. It's like, not, it's like, no, not that's a very, I think it's a very simplistic and very reductionist view, and I think it says more about what Europeans think of themselves than it does about actually the history, or at least some Europeans think of themselves. You know, obviously not all of them, but I think it's like the agency of the African in those periods, I think, is also denied, which is where I also found it problematic. You know, because to be honest, I think saying that, you know, Africans were living in a kind of noble savage utopia until Europeans came and introduced to them, you know, certain kinds of international trade and exchange and ambition and greed. It's just complete rubbish. It just isn't true. You
It's
know,
the same with
yeah.
Japan and China. Exactly the same. We went to conquer the savage lands. It's like,
Yeah, but it's yeah, it's the set, but it's the sense of, you know, that
superiority.
it's superiority. But then I think even the colonial period, it's kind of like, you know, it's like, I don't think, you know, a lot of people understand that, you know, a lot of the early European victories in Africa and in conquest were achieved only with the aid and support of certain African peoples. You know, in Portugal, for example, the 16th century, you know, it was, if the Congolese hadn't given them a foothold in Luanda, you know, what's now the capital of Angola, you know, there's no way they would have been able to make inroads if they didn't agree to take the children of the Congolese elites to Europe and baptize them, if they didn't manage to kind of, you know, convince the elites in particular that Catholicism was worth having. And again, it ebbed and flowed. There were some kings who, you know, engaged with it, African kings who engaged with it because they wanted, you know, greater access to trade or knowledge or whatever. And there are some who said, actually, no, we need to protect our traditional religion. That, you know, we're gonna take a step back from that. You know, it wasn't a linear, you know, progressive. You know, Europeans came with superior technology and weaponry and arms and numbers and just steamrolled, you know, African societies. It's really not how it happened. And even up until the 19th century, it still wasn't how. You know, I know in the case with Ghana with the Ashanti, you know, a lot of the victories, you know, the British were secured because of, you know, the support of the Fanti, for example, another group who were against the Ashanti. So I think a lot of that nuance as well in the way we record that history is lost. But I think it's because we're doing it from, you know, European perspective. And I think it also would tie into, you know, the attitudes that, you know, we have, like, for example, with the, you know, the 2020 and the Black Lives Matter movement, that kind of feeling that, you know, there's a requirement for Europeans to take action if Africans are to have any kind of, you know, agency or independence, or, you know, self proclamation or whatever it is. So yeah, it becomes very new. It becomes very, I think, twisted quite quickly when the nuance of history is lost.
I'm going to add another twist to this a little bit. So, my question, I'll say first what I want to say and then I'll ask my question. So, within the Slavic world, 'cause it's easier just to say Slavic world, there's a very big racial issue amongst ourselves where you've got Eastern Slavs, Central Slavs, Southern Slavs, and we all hate each other. It's especially now to do with Ukraine and Russia and everything else, it's become a racial war. Yeah, it's also to do with land, but it's the core of it is to do with race, even though we're supposed to be the same tribal people. Is this the same in Africa? Does it become racial to a certain point?
No, it's not. I mean, even the ethnic. I mean, even the ethnic. You know, it isn't. It's usually. I mean, I think we don't conceive of you know, of race, quote unquote, in the same way. You know, peoples are, even in you know, a group of people, even let's say, for example, the Yoruba in Nigeria, you know, as a people, they can, you know, consider this as a larger ethnic group, but, you know, that's quite recent. I mean, some people think it's even, you know, as late as the 19th century, but they're considered a group of people. But actually, historically, what they did was, you know, the people who are now considered, you know, generally Yoruba, associated themselves with different towns and cities. So they wouldn't say I'm Yoruba. They will say I am a person from X city. I am an Oyo, i.e., a someone from this city, the city of
Mhm.
Oyo, city from Ife. There was an understanding that they were, that they were related, had a similar ancestry. But then, there were, but there wasn't. And then when it came to conflicts, so for example, the Oyo fight with, going back to Agaja, they fight with Dahomey quite a lot. But that's more to do with, let's say, Oyo disagreeing with the way in which Dahomey was going about, certain things, or feeling that they had disrespected certain traditions, etc., etc. But it wasn't to do with the people they were necessarily. And actually, to my mind, I can't think of, any conflict, let's say, before the 19th century. I mean, people might bring up, Rwanda, but then again, I don't, I'd have to look into that into more depth. But I know that, up until, I think, to my mind, I can't think of any conflict that was sort of, ethnically motivated or came about because of
Mhm.
ethnic tensions necessarily. I mean, if it happened to be between two groups, it wouldn't be because the groups were different. It would be because of something else, and the groups happened to be different, fighting over X, Y, and Z. So, like the Dahomey, for example, people in the Dahomey are Fon, and the people of Oyo were known as Yoruba. But that, when people talk about the conflict, when you look into the conflict, that doesn't figure at all into it. It's more about power, trade, tradition, that kind of thing. I mean, tradition's a big one. That's actually why, to be honest, it seems a lot of people in Africa will engaged in in conflict is for tradition. Sometimes for power and control, for conquest, that kind of thing, but rarely to do with. But I think the understanding, like I said, of risk, I think there's the conception of it is different. And I think part of the reason for that is the huge amount of diversity, but then also the huge amount of mixing and migrating that's occurred in Africa over millions of years, actually. Since sapiens as a species didn't even exist, but even after that, that's the things, like the depth of the history just means that
Mm.
some of these classifications just do not make sense. Generally, in when you're the African mob, but then obviously there's been the adoption of other modes of thinking. But I don't know. I don't. Yeah, I don't. I don't. Not something that I've at least from what I've said, that I sort of observed in what I've been looking at anyway.
We've discussed so much about African history, and I've found it really insightful, and you've dispelled some of these sorts of myths and ideas that I had in my head, which is amazing in itself. But I'm assuming some of our listeners might want to know more. Obviously, your book is not out yet. We've got to wait another 8 months for that. But in the
Certainly.
meantime, what can you suggest for our listeners? Where can they go? What can they read?
I think probably the best resource at the moment is what's called the UNESCO General History of Africa. So it's basically in the late mid to late 20th century, UNESCO commissioned, or the African countries, with the help of UNESCO, basically commissioned African historians and anthropologists to write an entire history of Africa, and that's a really good. It's a little bit, it's the language is a little bit academic, but the information that you get there is really good. So I'd say, if you want to take it in little bits, and you can find all the volumes online. So it's called the UNESCO General History of Africa, and it goes literally from the beginnings of our species up until the 19th, 20th century, and it covers everything in between. And it looks at tons of different societies and civilizations, including some that I mentioned today, including Mali, ancient Kush, and what's now Sudan, and Africa in the Iron Age, and I've just talked about so much. So that's what I recommend. And then so that would be the first point of call, I think, for anyone who was just interested in learning just a little bit more, and with regards to something that's easily accessible as well. So yes, I think that's what I'd recommend. There are also some really good documentaries as well. Gus Casely-Hafer did quite a good one on the great civilizations of Africa, where he looks at a few of them. So I'd recommend that. And I think there's Channel 4. I think might be available on YouTube. I have to check. And then Zainab Badawi did one which was based on the general history of Africa that I mentioned, but that's on YouTube, to be fair. So that's easily accessible. but it's a condensed version, sort of because it's inspired by the general history, but it's something that's just a little bit more. It's just a bit easier to consume, but you probably won't get the same depth as you would in the books, but it's a lot easier to consume. So I'd say those three are good starting points.
Look, you've been fantastic. Absolutely loved this. And we'll get you back in 8 months, obviously. And in the meantime, I don't know if you fancy talking about something else you want to rattle on for about 40 minutes. Our door is
Yeah,
always
I'll
open
think
for you.
about it. Thank you so much. Yeah. But I know I'd definitely love to come back. Yeah, thank you.
Absolutely love this episode. And if you did, you know you can go ahead and give us a 5-star shiny review on Apple. We need those reviews. Just go and do it. We still have that website, which is www.historyhack.co.uk. Feel free to buy us a one-off donation or a cup of coffee on Ko-fi. That's ko-fi.com/historyhack. And you can always subscribe to our Patreon, which we would love for you to do because, again, we're poor and we need to fund our various different habits. So I'm going to leave you with my customary dad joke. And this one's kind of funny. I really like this one. So how does a penguin build his house? It glues it together. Thanks very much, guys.